Okay, in this video, I'm gonna discuss or explain on the inverse trigo function. So the first function that I will discuss is the inverse of sine function. So inverse of a sine function is actually come from the graph of the sine function itself. Where the graph of a sine function, if you can see, these are the graph of a sine function which you have learned back in Maths 1. Okay, but remember that when you want to have a inverse function, it must be a one-to-one function. So how to determine a one-to-one function? You can actually do a test where we called it the horizontal line test. So over here, if you draw the horizontal line test anywhere from the graph, okay, you will see there will be two or more than two, where you can have more than that, of intersection. Okay, so over here, the horizontal line test will be failed. So how is it that from the graph of a sine function, okay, so we want to make it a one-to-one function. So because a inverse function, it must be a one-to-one function. So what we can do is that we restrict certain domain, okay, certain domain from your graph. For our syllabus, so what we restrict is that we restrict on this particular part. Alright, we take it from a negative pi over 2 until pi over 2, where you can see that this part only that we crop out to become our function for the sine. Okay, so that when you do the horizontal line test, okay, so you can see over here, it will be intersect at only one point. So anywhere from the graph, it will intersect at only one point. So it passed your horizontal line test. So from there, we can have the inverse function for the sine. Alright. Now, so what do we do next? Okay, from here, if we take it that this is going to be the y equivalent to sine x, so we will have a smaller graph, or which is I already cut and paste, will be looking like this. Okay, the blue color graph, okay, this is where the part of where you cut off just now. Alright, you have the graph of y equivalent to sine x. Okay, so you restrict the domain from negative pi over by 2 until pi over by 2. Okay, you must remember that when you have an inverse function, the graph will actually reflect about y equivalent to x line. So you have this dotted pink color line. Alright, so if you draw your reflection graph, so you will be having this red color graph. Okay, so this is basically your red color is a graph of y equivalent to sine inverse x. Okay, so this is a graph for inverse function. Oops, sorry. So inverse function of sine, and the blue color is the graph of sine function. Okay, now let's look at the domain and the range for the graph. When you restrict the domain for the sine, which is the function y equivalent to sine x, the domain will be started from negative pi over by 2 until pi over by 2. Okay, and the range will be between negative 1 until 1. Alright, so you have that is the domain and range. Remember that back in Maths 1, that if you have the domain and range for the function f, the domain of f, if you have an inverse function, you can say that equivalent to the range of f inverse. And if you have the range of f, this one will be equivalent to the domain of the function f. Alright, so what we do, or what we're going to have is that the function y equivalent to sine inverse x, so you're going to have the domain as such, negative 1 until 1, where it comes from your range of function f. Okay, and then the range for your sine inverse function would be between negative pi over by 2 until pi over by 2, which is the domain of the sine function. Okay, now let's look at the example from the textbook, which is example 24, on a page 73, where you have to find the exact value of an inverse sine function. So the question asks you to find the exact value of the following. So you are given A, B, C, D, E. So let's do one by one, okay? So let's look at A first. They ask you to find, okay, sine inverse 1. So there are a few things that you can do lah. So the first step is that you let your sine inverse 1 into any unknowns. You can name it as Y, X, A, B, C, theta, gamma, alpha, whatever that you like. Okay, so any unknowns that you like. So for example, we let Y equivalent to sine inverse 1. So that we can do something with it. You can say that your sine Y is equivalent to 1. So you can say that your domain over here Y, sine Y equivalent to 1. Okay, you must remember that you are answering an inverse question, which is inverse sine function. So you have to know where the domain of the Y is in between negative pi over 2 until pi over by 2. Now, if you don't know where does it fall, it actually falls whether on quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. Okay, so because negative pi will be a negative angle going clockwise, negative pi over by 2. Here is negative pi over by 2. And pi over by 2 is the angle going anti-clockwise towards pi over by 2 or 90 degrees. Okay, so second thing is that you have to determine the quadrant. So a few things you have to do. First, you let Y equivalent to sine inverse, and then second, you determine the quadrant. So determine the quadrant is that whether you want to your angle will be fall whether at quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. Now, how do you look at? You look at what is the range or your answer for your sine Y. Okay, so sine Y over here is a positive value. So since your sine 1 is a positive value, if you use your add sugar to coffee, okay, your add sugar to coffee, so it actually will be whether at quadrant 1 or 4, because you want to look at these two quadrants only, so whether it's quadrant 1 or 4. So supposing your sine positive will be at quadrant 1, so only at quadrant 1. So since sine Y is positive, okay, so your angle Y will be actually fall at quadrant 1. Okay, so that's how you know your quadrant. Now, the third one is that you answer the question, because answering the question, you must remember you are answering for sine inverse. So according to the quadrant and also the domain of the inverse. Okay, the domain of the inverse part lah. Okay, since your Y over here is in between negative pi over by 2 until pi over by 2, and it falls on quadrant 1, sine Y, when is it will be equivalent to 1? It happens only at when this is 1. So over here, when is it that the angle is what is the angle that give you your sine theta equivalent to 1 when your angle is only 90 degrees? So 90 degrees, if you want to convert into the exact value, which is in radian form, you can say that your Y value is equivalent to pi over by 2. Okay? Now let's move on to the next example. Example part B, sine inverse half. So first thing first, you let your Y equivalent to sine inverse half. So then you can say that sine Y equivalent to half. Now remember that the Y falls between negative pi over by 2 until pi over by 2. Or you can say that this one whether at quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. So because your sine Y is a positive value, okay, determine the quadrant, so it is fall on quadrant 1. So over here you can see that this is fall on quadrant 1. Okay, so what is the angle of theta over here? Theta here should be, if you have sine Y equivalent to half, your angle should be 30 degrees. Okay, but because you want in exact value form, we want to put your answer in radian. So you can say that your Y equivalent to pi over by 6. Okay? Alright. Now move on. This sine inverse sec 3 over by 2. Negative sec 3 over by 2. So again, the first thing, you let any unknown. Now over here, I want to put it as theta. Now, it shouldn't be a problem, it's just an unknown, okay, theta, equivalent to sine inverse negative 3 over by 2. Madam, can I put it as x? You can always put it as x. Okay, if you want to put as y also, just like now, pun boleh. Right, so you're going to have, so let sine theta equivalent to sine inverse negative 3 over by 2. Then you have sine theta will be equivalent to negative 3 over by 2. Again, remember your theta here, because an inverse function, so your theta should be between negative pi over by 2 until pi over by 2. So what you can say this one, whether quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. Okay, again, if I cannot remember, this is negative pi over by 2. On top of it will be pi over by 2. Okay, now over here to determine the quadrant, you see, your sine theta is a negative value. Where does it fall? Is it fall like quadrant 1 or is it fall like quadrant 4? For a negative sign. Because your add sugar to coffee, you should know that negative sign should have been at quadrant 4. Okay, so quadrant 4, so you can have sine theta when it is a negative, it will fall at quadrant 4. So quadrant 4, because your angle, they want it in between negative pi over by 2 until pi over by 2 only, the restricted domain. So you have to adjust by finding the negative angle. Okay, now negative angle is clockwise. This is clockwise. Alright, what is it that you have angle of theta that will give you the value of sine 3 over by 2, your special angle? It should be 60 degrees. Very good. But because you want a negative angle, so you have to put here a negative angle. So negative 60 degrees. But again, because this question they're asking for exact value, you put your answer in term of radian, which is equivalent to negative pi over by 3. Okay. Alright, if you have a question, then we'll discuss in class. Alright, the last one. Okay. Now over here, it's a bit tricky. So it's not actually tricky. You just have to know that when you have a sine inverse 3 over by 2, this would give you undefined. Okay, the answer will be undefined. The question is why? Okay, now remember that because your sine y equivalent 3 over by 2, it does not belong in the domain of y equivalent to negative 1 until 1. Okay, you must remember that for inverse function, so when you have the inverse function of sine, your domain x here should be in between only negative 1 until 1. 3 over by 2 is much greater than 1. So since it does not belong between the domain negative 1 and 1, thus it will be undefined. Are you okay?